In this video, we're going to move on from our Egg Timer app to look at one of the fundamental user interface elements in iOS, that is the table view. This allows us to display potentially a huge amount of content in a way that the user can just swipe through very easily. Imagine a list of contacts or a busy inbox. So they're very powerful, but they are a little bit tricky to set up. So follow this one very carefully as we create a new project. We'll stick with single view application. I'll call it table views and save it on the desktop. All right, so we start over in main storyboard and we're going to drag in a table view. If I just search for table in the object library there, we can drag in a table view. And there it is. I'm actually going to stretch it all the way to the edges of the screen. And while I'm here, I'm going to set up constraints for it. So it will be stretched full screen regardless of screen size or orientation. Okay, notice that we've also got a table view controller. Now we'll be using those a little bit later on in the course. Essentially that allows us to have a whole second view or screen within our app. And we can segue or switch from one to the other. So that's a very useful thing to be able to do, but we're not going to be doing it that way quite yet. We're going to take things one step at a time and add our table view. So there's a couple of small changes we need to make to our table view before we go and add some code. And first off, we're going to add one prototype cell. And this cell then becomes, as it says, the prototype for the others. And we make all of our cells based on the design of this one. And there's one other thing we need to do to make it a little bit easier. I'm going to bring in the scene view here and then click on the table view cell. It's just a little bit tricky to click on the right thing in the storyboard itself. And I'm going to add a reuse identifier that allows me to identify that cell. We'll be using this a little bit later on. I'm just going to call it cell. You can call it anything you like, but cell is pretty much standard. Okay, while we're here actually, there are two other things we need to do. We need to control drag from the table view to the yellow circle at the top there. The yellow circle represents the view controller as it does here. And we're going to add outlets for data source and delegate. And essentially what we're doing there is we're allowing the view controller to supply, in terms of the data source, the data for the table, and delegate means that the view controller has power over the table and can essentially control it. We don't always need both of those, but it's a good habit to get into to just add them both every time, then you won't have any problems further on down the line. Okay, so now we've got our table view. We just need to write some code to dictate what's going to go on the table. So first off, we need to add two types to our view controller. So at the moment it has a type of UI view controller, so it controls the view, but we're going to want it to control the table as well. So we need to add UI, oh there we go, I've already added them so they're at the top of my list, but you might need to type a little bit more to get those to predict, but the first one we'll add is UI table view delegate. So as I say, this gives the view controller control over the table. And again, with basic tables, you can actually leave that out, but I'd recommend just adding it in so that it's there and you've got all the functions that you might need later on. And then UI table view data source allows you to control the source of the data in the table with your view controller, i.e. this file here. Now you can see we've got an error here saying that the type view controller does not conform to protocol UI table view data source. That's because there are a couple of methods that are required to use UI table view data source. And I'm going to show you a nice way of getting those methods. If you hover over UI table view data source and press Command and then click, that will take you to a description of UI table view data source and all of the methods that it includes. So there's a lot of methods there about editing, moving, reordering, etc. You can have a look at those in your leisure if you like, but the two critical ones that we're after are the two at the top. So number of rows in section and cell for row at index path. We'll explain more about what they do in a minute, but for now, just select those, copy them, and then bring them back to your viewcontroller.swift file, and then we're just going to paste them in like that there. And I'm going to get rid of the comments and rid of the available message. We don't need that. And I'm just going to add in curly brackets to contain the code for those two methods. So ignoring the messages for now, let's just be clear what these two methods are doing. This method is getting the number of rows in the section. So we're just having one section in our table. Unless you specify that you want more than one section, Xcode assumes that you just want one, which is normally the case. So this method is going to return the number of rows that we want in our table. So let's keep things very simple for now and just have one row. So this method is going to return the number 1. So essentially, at some point in the creation of the table, the method number of rows in section will be called, and this is like asking how many rows in the table are there, and it will return the number 1 to say that we're just going to have one row in our table. So that's what that method is doing. This one here, cell for row at index path, defines the content of each cell. And the index path is essentially the number of each cell. It starts at 0 with the top row and then goes 1, 2, 3 as you work your way down the table. So in this method, we need to create the cell and decide what we want to have in it. So we're going to create a variable called cell, which is going to be equal to a UI table view cell. There it is. And a UI table view cell is usually defined at the bottom there with a style and a reuse identifier. So the style, we're going to use the default, which is just UI table view cell style. There it is. Dot default. And then the reuse identifier is the identifier that we added a few moments ago for my prototype cell, which is just cell with a capital C. So let's add that in there. So now we know the identifier of the cell that we're setting up here. Then we're just going to decide what content we want within the cell. And we're going to do that using cell dot text label dot text. And we're going to set that equal to, for now, I'm going to set it equal to the text top row. So that means that the text top row will appear at the top of our table. Now, one message here is that the text label part of cell is an optional, as we've seen before. That means that it's possible for this text label not to exist, but we know that it will because we created the cell over here, and so we know it will have a text label attached to it. But we just need to put a question mark there to make it clear that we're aware that it's possible that this text label won't exist, even though we know that it will. Okay, so we've created our cell, we've given it a reuse identifier and a style, and we've set the text to top row. The last thing to do is to return the cell. So this will then return the cell itself so that it can be displayed within the table. All right, so quite a lot of complex ideas coming in here, but the main things to be clear on is that this first method is setting the number of rows in the section, or essentially in the table, and the second section is defining each cell and adding the content to it. All right, so this will actually work fine as it is, but you can see we've got a warning here that we should replace public with internal, and that's just making clear that we only need this function within this class, so we should define it as an internal method rather than a public one. All right, so let's give it a try. With any luck, we should end up with a full screen table with a single row of content at the top, and that row should have the text top row in it. And there we go. There's our table. We can even scroll it a bit, even though we've got only that little bit of content at the top there. It's a little bit too high up, but I don't think we need to worry about that for now. Okay, so it's a slightly tortuous process to create the table, but you just need to do essentially the same thing every time that you make one. Now, you may have noticed that so far we've got very static data for our table, which is not normally very useful. We don't normally want to just display some static data to the user. We want to get some information for them. Maybe it be their Twitter feed or inbox or whatever it is. So normally we're going to want to have some kind of array of data and then display that data to the user. So let's see how we can adjust our code to make it work that way. So first off, a very mini challenge for you. Can you create an array called cell content, which contains the names of 4 friends or family members of yours? Go for it. All right, hope you managed that. All we need is something like let and then cell content. We're going to set that equal to an array, and I'm going to choose my 4 family members. So Rob, Kirsten, Tommy, and Ralphie. All right, so this is the data that we want to put in the table. And so here I could put return 4, but then if I update my cell content array, then that's going to go wrong. So much better to put cell content dot count. And then I can update this anytime I like, and I won't have to worry about that number having to change. And then all we need to do is make sure that the content of each of these values within the array displays on the appropriate row on the table. And we can do that by accessing cell content, and then the number of the member of the array that we need is the index path dot row. So index path dot row will be 0 for the first one, for the first row in the table, 1 for the second, 2 for the third, etc. So that's it. That should display the contents of the cell content array in the table. So this is a much better way of making a table because all the content is separated from the table instructions themselves. Let's take a look. And there we go. Rob, Kirsten, Tommy, and Ralphie. Wonderful. Now, I am going to set you a quick table creation challenge simply because there are so many steps and it can be really fiddly. So it's very useful to go through the process yourself to get it all clear in your head. So very simply, the challenge is to create a new project and create a table containing the numbers 1 to 50. Simple as that. So 1 in the top row and 50 down at the bottom. And see if you can do that without using an array. Best of luck. Go for it. Okay, I hope you managed that. I suspect you probably forgot some of the more fiddly aspects, but I'll just lead you through it from start to finish again so that you are super clear on the process. So I'm going to call it 1 to 50. And we'll just create it in the usual way. And I'll zip through the table view creation process, just making sure that we cover everything that we need. So we'll start off in main storyboard, adding our table view. Here we go. I'm going to bring it down a little bit this time so that we don't overlap the info bar at the top. And then before I forget, add my constraints. There we go. Add a prototype cell. Give the prototype cell a reuse identifier. And link up the table with control drag to the view controller and set up outlets for data source and delegate. All right, that's everything on the storyboard side. Now over to viewcontroller.swift. We add in our 2 extra types here. With any luck, it will predict them nicely for me. So UI table view delegate and UI table view data source. Then we go to UI table view data source and command click to get the 2 methods that we need. I'm going to copy those, go back and paste those in. Get rid of the bits of code that we don't need. Add in the curly brackets. And then fix the warnings by replacing them from public methods to internal ones. And then I just need to think about how I'm going to display my 50 numbers. So I want all of the numbers from 1 to 50. I'm just going to hard code it right in here. So return 50. So there's going to be 50 rows in our table. And then here we need to create our cell. So as before, we do let cell to create a cell, and then this is going to be a UI table view cell. And we're going to create it with a style and a reuse identifier. The style is going to be the default. So UI table view cell style dot default, and the reuse identifier, as before, is just cell. All right, now we need to just set the cell dot text label, and I'll put in the question mark myself this time, because we know this is an optional because it might not exist, even though we know that it does. Dot text. And then we just need to work out how we're going to get the numbers 1 to 50. I'm going to do it using the index path dot row. But remember, that starts at 0. So all I need to do is add 1 to that. And that should give me 1 to 50. That's going to be a problem though, because that's an integer. So we're going to need to convert it to a string. There we go. Then we just return cell, and we should be all done. So let's choose our iPhone 6s and run that, and then take a look. I hope you managed to recreate more or less what I did there. You may have created an array with the numbers 1 to 50. You may have even done that with a while loop, which would have been a nice solution as well. And there we go. So firstly, notice that it doesn't overlap the top, which is better than it was before. And then we can scroll all the way down to number 50 at the bottom. Wonderful. All right, so now hopefully you feel reasonably comfortable with what's going on here with creating our tables. We're now going to create a times table app, which will use our tables as well as giving us an opportunity to use the slider. We'll be doing that in the next video.